Awesome. So we've got some folks chiming in. We had a lot of questions come in just on the sign up form. So we've got a lot of questions to get through. We won't be able to get through all of them, but if you have questions as we're going, just drop the question in the comments, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can while we're going through the questions that were submitted ahead of time. So we'll go ahead and get started with. We always like to start with like a fun question to get everybody engaged. So if you want to drop your AOL Instant Messenger screen name in the chat, this should be a really fun way to kick it off.
Got to reach back in the archives.
All right. While everybody's doing that, I think we can just go on ahead and dive right in. I'll kick us off with the first question, and it's one that I really like a lot. The question is, how do you think B2B podcasting will evolve over the next 12 to 24 months? Is there a place for very short 10-minute but highly focused podcasts for very busy business executives and entrepreneurs? So yes, I think super short episodes are absolutely going to be something that you see a lot of companies doing. B2B Growth started, we still do a lot of 12 to 20 minute episodes because we found the sweet spot for people that like shorter content as opposed to an hour and a half long episodes. I think either can work. What I think we're going to start seeing though over the next 12 to 24 months is podcasts being hosted by multiple people, both inside and outside of your company. So with B2B Growth, we're seeing this. We've got, I think, 19 different co-hosts for B2B Growth. We've got people inside our team. So Dan and Logan on this call are co-hosts of the show. But then we've also got folks outside of our company that are co-hosting different series. So we've got John Ruggie hosting the category creation series, Drew McClellan hosting the agency series. What it's allowing us to do is create way more content than any other show focused on B2B marketing. And we're curating who gets to be a co-host. So we can control the quality by saying, hey, these people that are already creating great content, come and host a series on B2B Growth, get access to the audience that we've already built, while simultaneously allowing us to create more content, which on a property that we own is only great for us. So now we can sell more advertising on those episodes because we have more episodes going out. But it also, the volume of content we're putting out, because we're doing 2 to 3 episodes a day on B2B Growth, it's differentiating our show from every other weekly or bi-weekly B2B marketing podcast. Logan, anything to add there?
No, I think you summed it up great, man.
Awesome. All right. Remember, for those that are new, throw in your questions in the comments. We had a ton of questions that got asked prior to just on the sign up form. So we're going to be getting through working through those questions that were asked coming into this. But we also want to make sure that the folks that are joining live get an opportunity to ask their question. So if you have a question, just drop it in the comments and we'll try to work through as many of those as possible. Logan, do you want to hit the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one that we get a lot with teams trying to decide who's going to be the host or the co-hosts. As James was just talking about, your podcast doesn't need to just have one solo host of the show, but most people are not broadcast trained. And I have a journalism background, but I was a photojournalism major, so I was more standing behind the camera than I was at the mic. I think there are a few things that you can do if you're going to be a podcast host and it seems a little bit intimidating, or maybe your CEO is, or someone else on your executive team. And it starts with a framework, both a framework for the interview, but one of the things James shared with me early on when I started as the host of a daily show immediately when I joined Sweetfish was a framework for the pre-interview conversation. So having some steps that you regularly go through to make the guest feel comfortable, because if they're comfortable, you're also going to be comfortable. If you're portraying confidence, they're going to be confident. And so in the pre-interview, when I'm doing podcast episodes, I focus on building rapport, establishing some sort of connection with the guest, letting them know what to expect, then kind of reviewing, hey, these are kind of the 3 or 4 questions we're going to go through, or these are the 5 bullet points that are going to frame our conversation. It's not going to be a script, but letting them know, okay, we still good with this. Maybe we want to go deeper here. Are you okay with that? Right. And just 5 or 10 minutes can really set the stage for a better interview. And then once you're in the interview, what I find that a few good podcasters that happen to be customers of ours that I've taken some things from myself, Ethan Butte, who hosts the Customer Experience podcast, he bookends his interview by asking a standard opening question and a standard closing question. Those can just be like, you know, if I used to play basketball in high school, not very good, but I was good at free throws because it was just muscle memory. And I found that, you know, it's the same sort of thing with podcast hosting. That can just be that muscle memory that is very, very repetitive and feels comfortable. The other thing is just getting in a habit of kind of synthesizing the information. Sangram Vajre at Terminus does a good job of this as he's taking notes and recapping for the listener. Well, I heard you say really these 3 things. Is there anything else you want to add? And that might kind of prompt the guest to say, oh, I forgot about this 4th thing or something like that. And then the last thing I'll say is the question that's always in my mind as a podcast host is, what follow-up question are listeners probably asking in their mind? That's probably what I should ask as a host. So those things, the framework for the pre-interview, the interview, and that constant question in your mind, I think can make you a great host when and the benefit is, hey, it's not live radio. You can always call a timeout.
Awesome. Dan, do you want to dive into one of the audience growth questions?
Absolutely. So somebody asked, how do you repurpose or get more use to promote the show after a release? And I think what they're talking about is like, what do you do when you have all these episodes coming? Each episode, what can you do to repurpose the episode or get the most bang for your buck to promote the overall show? And I think it is good. Like you have the initial episode and you push it out on social, like, hey, new episode with so-and-so. Well, that's great. But what do you do after that? Other than pushing it out there, you could push it out multiple times because not everybody's checking their feeds multiple times a day. Sometimes you push it in the morning and they don't check until the evening. And if it didn't get a lot of engagement, maybe you need to push it again, or maybe later on a second or third time if you're not producing like a daily show. Another thing we like to do is also turn them into blog posts if the quality of the content is good enough that we think we can earn a ranking for in Google with it. If not that, then you can actually take a bunch of episodes and turn it into some pretty good blog content. If you take your writers and be like, hey, here's 6 episodes kind of around the same topic. How can we string this together to make almost like a roundup post with all these experts giving their best advice on a specific topic? So you can also create blog content that way. One of my favorites is taking all these episodes. I almost think of them as like little assets that you have, things that you can use later on in all kinds of marketing situations. I like to take blog posts and think about like, where are people asking this question in our sales funnel or our marketing nurture funnel or in the customer segment where they're going through just using the tool? Where can this be work over and over again? So I often find that podcasts might answer questions that I'll just stick in an automated email. I noticed James has done this with a bunch of emails he's created in the past where he's just highlighting content that he did on an episode and then just linking to the episode itself after he's kind of outlined it in an email. And it said to get the full episode, check out this link. So you can repurpose that content to meet a bunch of different needs.
There's a couple things I'll add to that, Dan. I think when you're thinking about repurposing podcast content, one really ninja move that we have started doing a lot recently is micro videos. So the way our workflow works, somebody finishes an episode, it goes to our writer, and the writer determines what are the cuts that need to be made. So what were the good 1 to 2 minute clips from this episode? And they come up with headlines for each of those clips. They then send it to the next stage where those cuts and headlines get approved, and then it goes to our video team for us to turn those clips. And usually for a 15 to 20 minute episode, we found 3 to 4 good micro clips, and then you have multiple people on your team start to promote those video clips. So it's not just the host that's promoting the show. Now you're enabling different people on your team with great content that works really well on social. So the video is one thing, and then writing a little status update that actually shares kind of more than what the video shared. That's what I found what works with Gary V's micro videos so well is he's got the video, and it's almost two pieces of content. The video is sharing something, and then he's sharing something above and beyond that in the status update above it. And those I've seen tend to perform really well, as opposed to when you're just restating what the video said. I've seen that those don't tend to perform as well. I know that on LinkedIn, video does do really well, and we can see more views on a LinkedIn micro video than we'll see on, the number of total people that listen to the entire episode. So micro videos is one. The second one I would say is LinkedIn decks. So having a designer on your team turn an episode, take the three big ideas. You want to make sure you're actually sharing value in the deck and not just teasing the episode. That's a mistake that I see a lot of people making. They just tease the content as opposed to sharing at least one tangible idea from the episode. So LinkedIn decks and micro videos is what I would add to what Dan said.
That's awesome, James. And I just want to reiterate, whatever type of content it is, the question here is, how do I repurpose the content? To repurpose the content, it needs to have a purpose. It shouldn't just tease it, whether it's email, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's video. A lot of people are afraid if I share the value of this episode, then I give them no reason to click through and get to the episode. But we found that by actually unpacking it and sharing the value in a different channel, delivering that regularly, they will get the clue that, hey, I should just be subscribed to this show. I'll get even more value. Where a lot of people say, well, we answered these 3 questions, click here to get to the episode. And I think you might get some shorter wins, but in the long run, you're going to see more success actually delivering content when you repurpose it and not just tease the content.
Yeah.
The next one I wanted to go over real quick. This is kind of an interesting question. I don't get this a lot, but it leans into advice that we're giving to a lot of customers. It's, how should hashtags be efficiently used in headlines? Now, hashtags in podcast headlines are different than hashtags on social media channels. The way that we've been using hashtags is to call out a sub-series within a show. So as James mentioned on B2B Growth, we have multiple co-hosts. We've actually divided the show into multiple series. When we're going strictly to the sales side of the house, and it's not really applicable for exclusively for marketing teams, we have the hashtag sales series. For folks that are on an agency versus a brand side marketer, we have the agency series. And what we found is that we could have taken these different categories and spun off a different show, but we would be starting from scratch, trying to build 2, 3, 4, 5 different shows when we already have an established audience. And it allows you to do a few things to continue to build that audience. And if there's a marketer listening to B2B Growth that doesn't really care about the sales episodes, they see hashtag sales before an engaging headline, 3 ways to whatever, or how this team did XYZ. Putting that at the beginning allows those marketers to skip over the sales related episodes, or the salespeople that only want those episodes to keep a lookout for when those are ready. So that's how we use hashtags as a way to build series and kind of categorize the content within one feed, so you can focus all your energy in one area, but make it easy for folks to consume the content that they want.
Yeah. So where on other social platforms, those hashtags are utilized because it's part of that platform's algorithm. To my knowledge, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, they don't care about hashtags. We're only using it as a visual indicator to indicate that this content is a part of this series. And I would rather use the hashtag mark or the # instead of using the word series, because your headline only shows in Apple Podcasts so many characters. So you've got to be really mindful. We've got a couple longer series names, and it's almost frustrating to me because, like, category creation, it's just a longer name. So it takes up a lot of characters in our headlines, and you want to get to the sexy headline as quick as you can. You don't want to eat all that up with a super long series name. We just haven't figured out a better way. Maybe we change that to hashtag category instead of category creation, Logan, even just as I'm thinking through it now. Another question that we got was, how do I get high profile guests? And I saw this, and I love getting this question because I answer in a way that I think is not what most people think. I think you should rethink your strategy if your strategy is contingent on you getting high profile guests, especially in B2B. I see so many people. I'll give you an example of a customer that we had. He did sales training for home builders. and he wanted to go and get all of these he wanted to get Gary Vee, and he wanted to get Jesse, I'm blanking on his last name, but he wanted to get all these big name influencers that had 200,000 followers on Instagram, and he got some of them. And it was, he was like, man, that's great. But I was telling him the entire time, I was like, why are you not going out and interviewing the people that can hire you to come in and do sales training for their company at the home building company? And he was like, that's actually the smarter business decision. I can recognize logically it's smarter for me to interview my ideal clients on the show. But if I'm being honest with you, James, my ego wants to go interview Gary Vee. And this guy actually went to New York, interviewed Gary Vee in Gary's office, and Gary ended up using that interview as some micro content for Gary's social channel. So this guy hit the jackpot in terms of actually getting Gary Vee to promote his episode, which is very rare. It's very rare for you to get a big name guest and then they actually promote your episode, because they got famous for having their own content. They're going to prioritize promoting their own content. But even this guy who is able to get Gary Vee, and Gary Vee promoted the episode a few times, it still did not map to the kind of business result that this guy wanted, because it didn't map to him doing sales training at a home building company. If instead he had focused on whoever that decision maker is, the VP of sales at Lennar Homes, had he gotten that guy on a show about, hey, how do you do home building, like the home building podcast or the home building show, or getting industry experts that can actually hire you for what you do to be a guest on your show. I know Chip is doing this exceptionally well with their show. We try to push all of our customers into doing that approach. We call it content-based networking, interviewing your ideal customers or referral partners or people that can actually move the needle in your business, as opposed to going out and getting these high-profile guests that can't actually drive business results for you. I think a lot of the misconception is that, they'll share my episode and then my podcast will blow up, but it just doesn't work that way. I've interviewed Gary Vee. I've interviewed Simon Sinek. Those are some of our lowest downloaded episodes because they don't do anything to promote the episode 99 times out of 100. Our customer that I just referred to, he was the 1 out of 100 and it still didn't produce awesome results. So that's what I'll say there. Dan, what's the next audience growth question?
Certainly. In fact, I'm going to do a short production question and then do a longer audience growth question. The production question is, what is the best place to record at home? I mean, obviously your quietest room, but I also find room with more furniture in it that doesn't have like massive walls for sound to bounce around a lot. So if in doubt, just go ahead and use the voice recorder memo in here and just do a little sample test and see what the room sounds like. You can do it with a couple different rooms and just play with it, figure it out. Most rooms sound pretty good because they're furnished and have stuff in it. You can go as far as building your own little studio like I have, or just listening for what that room sounds like. Generally, if you have a good mic and your room is loaded with stuff, your room's going to sound pretty good. As far as audience growth goes, someone asked for just a list of audience growth tips and tricks. I actually shared a post on LinkedIn today. As far as growing your audience with your podcast, you can actually think about it in terms of just general marketing. And I like to break it up into paid, owned, and earned. On that post I posted today on LinkedIn, I list a bunch of different tactics under those 3 categories, but I'll just share my favorites that I'm personally working on the most for B2B growth currently. One thing we're doing is going to be running a lot of Facebook ads. While LinkedIn might be able to get more targeted, it's also very expensive. Facebook is still as popular as it's getting. It's still underpriced for the amount you pay per click. And you can also just get so targeted. So what some of my first priorities is just retargeting people who are hitting our site because they're likely our audience, and then just asking them to subscribe to the show, maybe even promoting specific pieces of content. Going back and looking through all the people we've had on the show, like Gary Vee's and Simon Sinek's, and then targeting their growth, their audience on the platform of Facebook. And maybe even having a crossover of B2B marketers by selecting a bunch of different interests and then finding the overlap between those 2 guests to promote the show and ask them to listen or invite them to come listen to the show with Gary or with Simon to get a little bit more out of those episodes, since they didn't get nearly as much as we would have hoped. It's a way to leverage some big guests if you have them. Another way is using SEO. As I mentioned, it's free. It takes a long time to build the kind of blog content Google's looking for, but I often find that if you find the keywords people are searching for on Google, which I usually just use Google's auto suggest. We've talked about using the kind of the alphabet soup method to tease out search terms from Google's auto suggest. But if you find that search term and you know you can write better content than what's currently ranking, it'll probably rank. And that'll deliver consistent, free, quality traffic over a long period of time if you can write the best answer on the internet for that particular search term. And I'll use podcast episodes to often create that content, whether doing it solo or having an expert guest come in and speak to what the questions I know will give me the content for that blog post.
Awesome. Dan, you good on that one? I've got a couple of questions that popped in here that I'd like to take real quick.
Fantastic.
Going off of what James was talking about in interviewing your ideal clients, this question I get a lot: how do you make the pivot to a sales conversation? And this is definitely more art than science. If I had a 5-step plan to always follow, then I'd probably be on a yacht somewhere. Quite honestly, maybe not right now, but anyway. There's 2 ways I think about it: making the transition when it's appropriate and doing it in a very natural way. So recently, I'll give you for instance, and this will be different because not everyone on this call sells to B2B marketers like we do here at Sweetfish, but I was interviewing a B2B marketer who could be a potential prospect for us here at Sweetfish on the podcast. They're very much into content consumption data, gated content. And, after the interview, I asked a question like this: well, since you guys are all about every little measurable piece of content consumption, a podcast probably hasn't been on your radar because it's ungated content. It's more top of funnel. It doesn't align with some of those things you were talking about. And the guest was like, and this was in the post-interview conversation, he was like, well, no, we've thought about it, And he opened the door for me to ask the question of, should we schedule a call here? And so I find asking the question in a way that's related to something that you've talked about, much like you would at a networking event or something like that. Even a networking event, oftentimes you're not just coming in right away with, hey, could we do business and let me qualify you? But you're looking for those natural segues in a way to make it natural. And one of those tips I've got from Chris Voss, author of Never Split the Difference, is ask a question that's designed to get a no. If you notice in the way I asked that question was, you've probably not thought about a podcast because of this, this, and this. When you're kind of teeing them up to say yes, they kind of feel like they're being painted into a corner. But when someone says no, then you're setting them up to say no and say, no, this is where I'm at, and I'm going to kind of defend the stance. The other way, more often than not, I'm not making a hard pivot to the sales conversation. I'm looking for, how can I add more value? Because if I've already added value by inviting them as a guest and letting them talk about their expertise, we're going to share their episode. We've talked about things that they're great at. What other things, if they mention something in their episode that I can help with by making the right introduction, or I can provide another piece of content that would be helpful for them. I'm always looking for what 2 or 3 ways can I follow up and add more value to make them want to come back when they're ready. And more often than not, that's my strategy is, the first, having them on the podcast is one jab, as Gary Vee puts it, or one deposit. I'm not going straight for that right hook. I'm looking for what are 3 more jabs before I give that right hook. So those are 2 ways that I go about it in my day-to-day, because I'm a host of a podcast and I also run sales for Sweetfish.
Chip mentioned this in the comments, and it's something we talked about on the last Q&A, but getting people to text message is going to be really, really crucial. So if you're not following along, if you didn't see Chip's comment, appreciate you bringing that up, Chip, because that is, I think, really critical, especially if you can get their cell phone number on the sign-up form for when they chose a time to do the interview. You can text them pre-interview to just say, hey, Chip, really looking forward to our interview coming up in a few minutes. Let me know if you have any questions before we get started or whatever. You can do that even a couple hours leading up to the interview. So then it disarms them. It deepens the relationship even before they hop on Zoom. And I've found that when podcast hosts do that with me, when I'm a guest on their show, I even had one guy send me a video message in text, and it was awesome because I was like, oh man, I already feel like I know this guy. So whenever I got onto Zoom, it was that much more comfortable. And then afterwards, I think he texted me, he was like, hey man, that was great. Building that level of depth in the relationship through the medium of text, I think is it's not, super automated. It's just personal text. Maybe you use Google Voice as a platform for that if you don't want to use your personal number. But I think getting there is huge. So thanks for bringing that up, Chip. There's a question on here about how long should each individual episode description be. I don't want to hang out too long on this one. It's a great question. I don't think it matters all that much. I personally, my consumption of podcasts, I don't look at episode descriptions very often. I think ours for B2B growth are maybe 1 or 2 sentences, and then we add any relevant links that we mentioned in the episode. And then we have our sponsor for that episode. I think we've got a little clip where we link to their product. So that's the extent of it. Logan, is there anything else to add there, you think?
There's one standard practice we've applied to our shows and a lot of our customer shows, and that is at the bottom of the description, making sure that you have links to the 3 primary podcast platforms at the bottom of the description: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And that may seem a little counterintuitive. Why would I link to a podcast app in the description? Well, the reason is someone who's new finding your show, they may have landed on it on your website or on the Libsyn page that's really ugly, and they just found it by doing a Google search, or in a platform that they don't normally listen in. So giving them, reducing that friction for them to be able to click their player of choice and get subscribed, so it's not just a one and done listen. It's a very easy way to enable that by just always having that standard footer at the bottom of your description or show notes.
There's another question on here from Kevin. Do you have any tips on syndicating your podcast on other outlets? Kevin, I think I'm understanding your question here. If you're referring to like Spotify and Google Podcasts, and instead of just being an Apple Podcast, that's actually something you can do through your host. So I think Anchor does this. Libsyn does this. Libsyn is what we use to host all of our shows. So if that's not what you were referring to, jump into the comments and let us know. We can clarify, but it should be pretty easy to do that through whatever host you're using to host your podcast. It's just something you set up on the back end one time, and then it automatically syndicates it to all of those platforms every time you upload a new episode.
And even if there's new platforms added in those, your host doesn't automatically sync to them. Usually they're just looking for the RSS feed to get the host or to get the show, the episodes. And once you set it up, like James said, it's set and forget. So those are all one-time setups at the very beginning of your podcast.
It does, guys, look like Kevin was asking about other media outlets, blogs, other channels to get them.
So my thing there is you have to come at it with a give first mentality. We have so many people that want us to interview them on B2B growth, and they come to us with an ask of, hey, I'd love to be a guest on B2B growth. And I want to respond and say, sure. I'm sure you want to be a guest on our show that we've spent years building 130,000 listeners a month for. Like that's duh. Like of everybody, like a lot of people want to be on our show. So I think if they approached us in a different way and said, hey, we'd love to feature you on what we're doing, and work the relationship in a genuine way where you're giving value up front as opposed to asking for something in return. So if you want to get your show syndicated on other blogs or other media players or media companies, then collaborating with them, trying to add as much value as you possibly can. Can you, hey, I want to interview your CEO and we're going to promote it to our list of 10,000 people, or, we're going to talk about it on LinkedIn. We're getting great engagement there. So I think you have to be relatively good at getting attention on your content first so that you can offer that as value to these other media outlets that you want to ultimately have, pointing a spotlight on your content. You have to give first. Logan or Dan, any other thoughts on that?
Trying to think of ways you can get started, even if you're only like 30 episodes and you don't have a massive platform yet, to try to swap. I mean, you kind of have to look beyond even your platform and think about like, what else can you do to add value? I even think like I've noticed there's even on my own LinkedIn channel, there's people dropping really helpful and really good comments on my posts regularly, and they're standing out to me. I don't really even have an incentive to invite them on the show, but we're starting to become friends now. And I'm like, I think I'm going to invite so-and-so on the show just because now I kind of want to get them know the better. And it seems like they have some really good ideas because they're showing up a lot
Yeah.
and they're dropping really awesome value in my posts.
There's one question on here that Rick asked, and I saw Rick on here earlier. I don't know if he's still on here, but he said recent polls seem to show that podcasting is declining. It might be temporary due to the pandemic. Will that change? Also, what are your thoughts on vidcasting? Will it replace audio podcasts? I don't think video podcasting will replace podcasting just because podcasting is so passive in nature. You can listen to a podcast while you're mowing the lawn, while you're doing dishes. I think you should be doing video with your podcast because of the repurposing opportunities and being able to do micro videos. But I don't think that it's going to replace podcasting simply because people do listen to podcasts while they're passively while they're doing other activities. But around the recent polls, this is really interesting. We actually saw a very sharp decline in our listenership. So we were getting around 120 to 125,000 downloads a month. COVID hit and that dropped. I think the first month it dropped to like 95,000 downloads. The next month, the month after that, it was like 93, I think. So it was in the low to mid 90s. And then last month it skyrocketed to 138,000 downloads. So there's been this really weird pattern. We saw a sharp decline and then a massive uptick. And I don't know if that's because people are finally getting into the rhythm of how they're going to listen to podcasts while they're, having to work from home. So maybe like, hey, I'm going to start taking a walk around the block or whatever, but they're figuring out how to work, at least for our show, they're figuring out how to work the show into their new normal. So I thought it was a great question and I wanted to make sure we touched on it. We've come up on the end of our time here. I want to honor all of your time. But we're going to be doing this again next month. So if you've got other questions, be on the lookout for, we'll send an email to you next month and you can sign up again for our July podcasting Q&A. But thank you all so much for being here. We really do value your engagement and your willingness to contribute here. So we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.